Welcome. What we have today is the new and somewhat controversial 50mm f1.1 M-mount lens from 7Artisans. The lens itself is conventional looking and seems fairly nicely finished. It has a tight-fitting metal front cap and a back cap which is actually a bit too shallow. As you focus toward infinity, you can feel the back of the lens binding against it. Once you remove it, everything moves normally. One thing that you don't see much anymore, and that's a little bit antique, is that you'll notice that the aperture markings are unevenly spaced. This used to be par for the course in lenses from the old days up until maybe the mid-1950s. Now the marks are usually more evenly spaced. Another interesting thing about it is that there are no click stops. Videographers who want to use the lens will probably like that. Street photographers will find it a little frustrating. You will notice that the lens diaphragm supposedly has 12 blades and makes a very smooth circle. One reason that rangefinder camera lenses in general and M-mount lenses in particular have always been quite expensive is that their mechanical construction needs to be very, very precise. A big part of the reason for that is that focusing is controlled by this cam, which you can see moving as I focus the lens in and out. It's brass colored and it turns in step with the movements of the focusing ring. This moves a roller inside the camera body to couple the lens's focusing action to the action of the rangefinder optics. This coupling has to be very, very precise, especially with such a wide aperture lens. And in the old days it wasn't unusual to need to send your Leica back to the factory to be calibrated for best results with your super speed Noctilux lens, for example. 7Artisans has cleverly avoided this need for precision by outsourcing the job to you. The lens is specially designed so that you can do fine calibration yourself. It's not just a hack, it was really designed to work this way. If you look inside the back of the lens at the coupling cam, you can see that it has a small set screw at either end. And by loosening these set screws, you can turn the cam back and forth by a very small amount to get the lens's focusing movement exactly calibrated to your camera's rangefinder. One thing I found while doing this was that once you've loosened the screws, the ring moves fairly easily, so it's a good idea to keep your thumb on it so you don't shift it more than you had intended. You might be asking yourself, how am I supposed to know how to calibrate my lens? And the answer is that 7Artisans has provided you with this little printed guide that actually makes it fairly easy. You set up your camera about 2 meters away from your target and at about a 30-degree angle. Obviously a tripod is very helpful. I did find that these measurements don't need to be absolutely exact. Just get it in the ballpark of 2 meters and 30 degrees and you'll probably be fine. There are illustrated instructions inside that show you where the screws are and how you adjust the lens for near or far focus. And on the other side, there's the target that you actually use for making the measurements. You have a nice clear cross in the middle on which you line up your camera's rangefinder. Then you take a test picture, and depending on whether your real focus point is nearer or farther, you turn the focus cam either clockwise or counterclockwise. You'll notice that at this distance, which is fairly significant, they tell you to make an adjustment of 0.5 millimeters, which is very, very small. On the other end, you'll be making an adjustment in the range of 0.5 millimeters to 1 millimeter. So you have to be pretty delicate while you're doing it. I have to admit, in all honesty, that my lens was pretty darn accurate right out of the box. To understand why all this precision is important, you need to understand something about how a rangefinder camera works. What makes a rangefinder camera is that it has a rangefinder, an optical focusing device that uses two separated windows and lets you determine the plane of best focus without looking through the lens. The way that this works is that inside the camera, behind the second window, the smaller one, is a pivoted mirror that swings back and forth as you adjust the focus. You can see that when the mirror is pivoted at the right angle at the subject at which you've pointed the camera, it provides convergence with the image you see through the main window, and by simple trigonometry that tells the camera the correct focusing distance. The thing that makes that work inside the camera is a lever called the coupling lever, which is tipped with a roller called the coupling roller. When the lens is on the camera, its coupling cam that we saw earlier presses against this roller and moves it in and out as you change the focusing distance on the lens. This arm and roller are what transfer that motion to the rangefinder objects that enable you to focus the camera accurately. As you can see, the amount of movement involved is very small, so everything in this system needs to be very, very precise. This is the 50mm f1.5 Voigtlander Nocton lens made by Cosina. This particular version of the lens isn't available anymore. It was made to go on the Leica screw mount, and I'm using a screw to bayonet adapter to mount it on my M-mount camera. As you can see, even though the 7Artisans lens is a full stop faster, it's not all that much larger than the Voigtlander lens. Another possible comparison for people who like super speed lenses is the notorious Canon 50mm f/0.95 lens made for Canon rangefinder cameras back in the early 1960s. This lens has a slightly wider maximum aperture, but as you can see, it's quite a bit bigger. For example, it uses a 72mm filter thread, whereas the 7Artisans lens uses a 55mm thread. That not only saves space and weight, it means that if you want to use, for example, a neutral density filter, so you can shoot at full aperture all the time, you can use a smaller, less expensive filter. At this point you might be wondering how the 7Artisans lens compares to these other two. One that is newer and not too expensive and has a good reputation for performance. The other that's old, is something of a collector's item, is pretty expensive now, and has a reputation of being absolutely all over the map. So just because there will be some people who say, dude, that RD1 only has 6 megapixels, my phone's got more than that, I'll also try it out on this 24 megapixel Fuji X Pro 2, which is equipped with an M-mount adapter. To get an idea of what the 7Artisans lens image quality looks like, I'm going to use Lightroom's compare feature to compare it to the f1.5 Nocton lens. Of course, this isn't a real lens test, it's just to give you a qualitative idea of what the images look like. But if you zoom in to 1:1, you can see fairly significant differences. Now, the Nocton lens is a modern design that has a good reputation as being fairly inexpensive to buy, but still a good performer. You can see it looking at the central part of the image, even at f1.5, the image is sharp and the flare quality is quite compact. Comparing it to the 7Artisans lens, you can see that even in the center, the details are somewhat more hazy. You do see a fairly sharp core of detail in the center of the image, but it's surrounded by this glow, which is technically a flaw, but some of us find desirable for some kinds of pictures. As you get farther and farther off axis, you can see that the Nocton holds up quite well, but the image from the 7Artisans lens gets more and more smeary. By the time you get clear out to the corners, and again, keep in mind this is on an APS-C size sensor, you can see that the Nocton lens is beginning to look a bit smeared, but the 7Artisans lens is distinctly smeared. Keep in mind, though, that we are looking at the 7Artisans lens at f1.1, which means it's a full stop faster than the Nocton, so it's not super surprising that its performance perhaps isn't quite as good. To level the playing field a bit, I'll stop down the 7Artisans lens to f1.4. That's a more fair comparison to the Nocton at f1.5. You'd have to admit, though, that even at the same lens aperture, the 7Artisans lens still has not lost its slight hazy appearance. It's certainly more compact. You still see good detail. If you look at the dust specks on this book jacket, for example, you see just about as many of them as you do in the Nocton photo, but there's still that smearing in the image details that you don't see in the Nocton, and that gets progressively worse as you move away from the center. Mind you, again, there's still texture and detail. If you look at the fabric in these two book spines, you can see that you're seeing essentially the same detail level as you do in the Nocton photos. It's just more smeared and lower in contrast. Again, by the time you get out to the edges, the 7Artisans lens is pretty heavily smeared, whereas the Nocton shows some smearing, but not nearly as bad. Some people might be inclined to say, why don't we just stop there? There's no point in buying a super wide aperture lens if you're not going to shoot it at super wide apertures. But I don't believe that. Particularly if this is your only 50mm lens, you might want to use it at more moderate apertures for more normal kinds of picture taking. So let's take a look at these two lenses both at f5.6. And we're going to, again, go into a 1:1 magnification, and here things are starting to get kind of interesting. I don't know what you think, but I would take the position that at least in the center, by this aperture, the 7Artisans lens is looking a little cleaner than the Nocton. You can see it especially in these high contrast type areas where the 7Artisans lens produces a very clean looking image and the Nocton's image is just a bit hazy looking. Now mind you, by the time you get out to the corners, even though the centered texture areas are at least as good on the 7Artisans lens, by the time you get out to the corners, the Nocton still has a significant edge. This is beginning to look pretty hazy over here, but still, if you tend to shoot mostly with things in the center, the 7Artisans lens is beginning to look like a good prospect. Just for the heck of it, let's compare both lenses at f8, which is an aperture you might use for studio photography, for example. By this point, I think it's pretty clear that the 7Artisans lens is producing a sharper, crisper central result than the Nocton lens. Compare this area of type to this area, for example. Also, the 7Artisans lens, I think, has better texture detail. If you look at the fabric on these book spines and compare them to the same area on the Nocton, the 7Artisans lens just looks crisper. Again, where the 7Artisans lens falls down is when you get out to the corners. And again, bear in mind that this is on an APS-C size sensor. If you have a camera with a 36 by 24 size sensor, I have absolutely no idea what would happen out at the corners. However, if you do have a Leica M10 that you don't need for the next 4 or 5 months, feel free to send it along and I'll test it out for you. Again, out at the corners though, that you can see that the Nocton is significantly better in terms of detail. So that's something to keep in mind when you're deciding which is more appropriate for your style of photography. Just because everybody loves a crazy comparison, I'm going to compare the 7Artisans lens, this time over on the left, to the Canon 50mm f/0.95 lens that was made for the Canon 7 series rangefinder cameras back in the early 1960s. Now this lens was an incredibly audacious design for its day, and now people seek it out for its dreamlike, hazy, flary quality at full aperture, combined with the fact that by the time you stop it down a few stops, it can be used as a conventional normal lens. So let's take a look at the two at their full apertures and see how they compare. You can see what I'm talking about looking at the Canon lens over on the right, where you see gorgeous, flary, hazy, ghosty edges around just about all the details in the picture, and yet the details in themselves are reasonably clear. You could take the position that if you want to get that flary, ghosty effect and you don't want to spend quite what it costs to find a Canon 50-095 and have it adapted to your current camera, the 7Artisans lens isn't a bad alternative. Again, just in case you're going out to make hazy, flary pictures and you find yourself in an emergency situation where you need to make a conventionally sharp photo, let's compare the two lenses at f8. As you saw in the last set, the 7Artisans lens looks quite good on the center here. In all honesty, I've got to say that the Canon does as well. The 7Artisans lens may have just a slight edge in terms of cleanness of high contrast details, and if you look at the texture of fabric on the book spines, I'd say it does have a slight definite edge. Again, the Canon lens is no slouch for 1961 technology. When we go out to the corners, it's interesting how similar they look. Again, maybe the Canon looks just slightly better. The 7Artisans has that same little bit of smeariness you noticed once before, but really at f8, they're not all that different. If anything, the 7Artisans lens may be slightly ahead, so it's kind of a wash. Keep in mind, though, that the Canon lens is hard to find. You'll probably have to pay extra to adapt it to use on a modern camera, whereas the 7Artisans lens comes in an M mount and you can buy one brand new for $370. Before we wrap up the comparisons, there's one more point I want to address. Some people are probably saying, look, if you just want narrow depth of field and out-of-focus backgrounds, why don't you use a conventional modern lens that gives good performance at all apertures? Again, it depends on what you want, and that may be exactly what you want to do. But so you can see for yourself, here's a comparison between, on the right, the Fuji 56mm f1.2 lens, which is a modern lens with a good reputation, and on the left, the 7Artisans lens. I apologize for not framing them exactly the same, but this was only kind of a test and mostly a shooting session. Over here on the right, as you'd expect, we get sharp details. The eyelashes are crisp. You see a lot of skin texture whether you really want to or not. On the left, with the 7Artisans lens, we still see good detail in the eyelashes. We see some details in the eyes, but that full aperture glow that the lens produces subdues the skin texture and gives the overall complexion just more of a hazy, glowy appearance. Some people don't like that and would rather have the crisp, modern appearance like this. Some people do like this, and for that you do need a lens that has somewhat special qualities, such as the 7Artisans lens. the 7Artisans lens a tryout under real-world conditions, I took it along to a studio photo session I'd had planned, and after my exuberant friends calmed down a little bit, I was able to try it out on several setups, along with the lenses that I'd normally use for this kind of situation.
Your hair is missing.
It worked well on my M-mount camera, although I did have to be very careful to focus accurately, and I noticed when shooting it at full aperture against the light, it did have a fairly noticeable tendency to flare out. On my Fujifilm X Pro 2 camera, the lens was more of a significant problem. Its signature of details surrounded by halos meant that many of the focusing assist aids just didn't work very well. Often I thought I was getting sharp pictures, but when I looked at them later I discovered they were just plain out of focus. That's going to be a significant problem using this type of lens with a non-rangefinder camera. So what should we make of the 7Artisans 50mm f1.1 lens? Well, frankly, if you don't have any problems with dropping $7,000 on a new Leica M10 body, I'd suggest you drop a few thousand more on a genuine Leica M-mount lens. Likewise, if you're looking for a lens you can adapt to a Sony E-mount or other mirrorless camera, I suggest you look at other options. There should be other lenses that can produce the same soft, glowy effect that will cost less because they don't need the expensive M-mount cam and expensive precision machining. For me, this lens really only makes sense to use on an M-mount camera. If you're just getting started on M-mount photography, maybe with one of the Bessa cameras or a used Leica that you acquired from a relative, it's a good choice because it's the least expensive M-mount lens you can buy new, and it's useful in two different ways. Shot wide open, it gives the soft, glowy, pretty effect that many people like, and stop down, it's a very sharp, good performing normal lens.